Hi there. With the cancellation of Wheel of Time over at Amazon Prime this past week, combined with some major shows wrapping up their seasons just because it's the end of spring, things can seem pretty scary right now for the future of TV fandom. I want to help make sense of things for you by putting all of this in its wider context, in terms of business trends, state of the industry, why this is happening, and why it'll end. Because I've seen some news sites and fan channels claiming that the cancellation of Wheel of Time is, quote, the end of the fantasy TV boom. And also pointing out how thin the TV schedule is for the rest of 2025 as evidence of things aren't getting better. Well, I disagree with both points. What I'll argue in this video is there never really was a fantasy boom in the first place, if you think about it. And the relatively light schedule the rest of the year is just due to the ripple effects of the 2023 strikes. That we are seeing the last ripple effect of the strikes 2 years later, and there's actually a lot to look forward to in 2026 if you see their production schedules. But most of us will be focusing on, what do you mean there was never a fantasy boom? There was never a successful fantasy boom. Now, like I said at the end of my last video, talking about the cancellation of Wheel of Time, I appreciate the reporting that winteriscoming.net has been doing on this, and they're covering it really well if you're a Wheel of Time fan, if this is why Apple should pick it up, everything that went wrong. They were really upset about the cancellation, and they made an article titled, "This Marks the End of the Fantasy Boom." I completely sympathize with why they feel like that, and I've seen others like Road to Tarvalon saying this might be the end of the fantasy boom. But I disagree because whatever you want to call it, that already ended in summer of 2022 in terms of the burst of new fantasy shows in the wake of the end of Game of Thrones, at the same time that all the big streaming wars launches were happening 2019. That Chance Design happened the same year. Game of Thrones ended, then there were these giant launches for new streaming platforms. Whatever that was, it had already ended by summer of 2022 because they weren't greenlighting things anymore. Arguably ended before the last two heavy hitters even came out, because House of the Dragon and Rings of Power came out fall of 2022. But if you're looking at it from the production side, which is 2 years behind of what are they deciding to greenlight or not, they were already reaching business problems when they hit the subscriber ceiling in early 2022. But even then, to start with, there's multiple facets to this. Let me run through this. I'm sorry I'm dashing this off as a bonus sequel video to my one on the cancellation of Wheel of Time, so I have to do this as an audio-only podcast, unedited, unfortunately, but I have written it out. That in the immediate aftermath of Game of Thrones in 2019, there was this burst of follow-the-leader fantasy shows, each trying to cash in on the trend. Even then, few of those fantasy shows in 2019 were actually serious attempts to make a new Game of Thrones scale show. So we're already talking about the difference between a burst in fantasy shows in general, most of which were one-season wonders or forgotten, and the smaller handful of trying to be a flagship show projects like Wheel of Time or Rings of Power or House of the Dragon. You could number these on one hand. It's those plus The Witcher, maybe one other, is what we're talking about as the fantasy boom, of the ones that were actually successful. And even then, were these successful? Except for House of the Dragon, and Witcher's first season was a reasonable hit, but there wasn't an across-the-board fantasy boom success. Now, case in point, and I will link this below, I already made a video a full 2 years ago, in March of 2023, saying it was titled, "The Search for the Next Game of Thrones is Over." That I won't repeat everything. Please check that out just to skim it through the search bar because it has more charts and lists on screen that I'm going to put in here. This is an audio-only podcast. Check that out just to skim through. I screenshot a lot of articles in it from 2019 in Vanity Fair and TV Guide listing, these are all the shows right now and the new streamers trying to be the next Game of Thrones. And if you combine, I went back, checked my old video, plus Googling around to those 2019 articles of these are things, using that phrase, the fantasy boom, the next Game of Thrones. There's about 20 series that at one point or another in these big lists were being included as things people are looking forward to. Hardly any succeeded. Most were one-season things that weren't even at the scale of Game of Thrones, so it's just the fact that it's a minor fantasy series. Why would you even include this in the list? It was a mistake. Prime example. The Netflix series Cursed, based on Arthurian mythos. Do you remember that? No. Well, that's kind of my point. That even back then, like, news sites were covering it and people were doing episode reviews, and it was a decent show. It had its fans. I'm not criticizing that. It's just the review sites were trying to do episodic recaps, hoping it would turn into Game of Thrones, and it was never meant to be. So a lot of this is them building up hype that people imagined a fantasy boom. And yes, a few more minor shows were being greenlit, don't get me wrong, but it's not as if it was a giant boom. It was just there were a few more as a trend. So really there isn't that much difference from then and now. Second aspect of this. Quite a few shows on those, I mean, there's objectively lists in news sites from then that I looked and compared and looked up what happened to them. Even 2 years ago in 2023, when I was making my original video, I said, a lot of the shows that they were hyping up as the potential next Game of Thrones never even filmed. They died in production. Case in point, a big thing on these potential Game of Thrones successor lists was that back in 2019, Showtime was putting considerable effort into trying to make a TV series based on Kingkiller Chronicle. It got stuck in development hell and died before they ever filmed it. So some of these things were just potential shows. Others were minor one-season shows that weren't even trying to be something on the scale of a flagship like that. And the other weird part is fantasy is a big tent. And I like to, I'll come back to this in the video, I like to think that sci-fi and fantasy make no distinction. Star Wars is a space fantasy. But sticking to this for now, what about, like, urban fantasy, or romantic fantasy, or political fantasy, high fantasy, low fantasy? Wheel of Time is high fantasy, Game of Thrones is gritty, low fantasy. What about historical epics, like Shogun has got overlap with us, even though it's a historical drama? What about children's fantasy? Define fantasy boom. That it's too broad to be really a trend. That another big thing on that list of the next Game of Thrones after Cursed, which was a minor show, or Kingkiller Chronicle, which could have been had it been made, but it wasn't, the same genre. Back in 2019, Netflix was in major public discussions to make a Chronicles of Narnia TV series. Chronicles of Narnia is a children's fantasy series with heavy Christian allegory, and I loved it growing up. I even watched the BBC version after I had read it as a kid, just because it was on TV, and I liked the movies they made, but I actually was a fan of the book just because I read it. It's a quick read. It's a children's book. Not just the first one, like through Prince Caspian and everything, but are you seriously telling me that Chronicles of Narnia could be the next Game of Thrones? Because Vanity Fair and TV Guide sure as hell put it on their lists as potential next Game of Thrones. And while it does have a large fan base in terms of the scale of it, you could make it, there are large-scale movies for it and stuff, this could never have been Game of Thrones. Even if it was popular, it would be like the next Harry Potter or something. All of this ties together as my next big conclusion or thematic point to remember from this video. That not only should children's fantasy series never be included in the first place in those lists that actual news sites are making of potentially the next Game of Thrones back in 2019, not only should children's fantasy have never been included, if you stand back and objectively survey the state of TV right now in early 2025, and looking ahead near future to what we know is coming in the next year or so, children's and young adult fantasy is booming right now. For live-action projects, live-action TV, it's as strong as it ever was. Disney Plus has a successful Percy Jackson and the Olympian series. And the biggest is yet to come, that for good or ill, next year, fall of 2026, Warner Discovery on HBO is doing this massive Harry Potter remake. The Harry Potter TV series. Like $100 million per episode, 6-episode seasons. They intend for it to run 10 years. I think it'll at least run 3, even if it's not good. But a massive Harry Potter TV series, which they are treating as the cornerstone moneymaker of their entire corporation. Now, it might not do as well as the original movies, but I don't think, at least in the near term, it would be a mega flop any more than, well, Rings of Power wasn't this utter mega flop, it just underperformed. There's a difference between mega flop and underperforming. And I've said this before, that I think these will be moderate successes, but the amount of money they're pumping into it, that to break even, they don't need a moderate success. They need the next Lord of the Rings trilogy. They need to be making as much money as the original Harry Potter movies to break even. I don't think they're going to do that, but I think it's unlikely they'll totally collapse, at least not in the next 3-year window or something. That at least near term, people will be making excuses. I'm not even watching it. I don't care. I think it's a terrible idea, but near term, at least for the first season, it'll get people talking. Even if the first season isn't that good, it'll be people going, oh, well, they'll refine it. Other stuff, whatever. It doesn't need to be good to make other streamers panic, and their perception is, we need our Harry Potter. This is exactly what happened with the Harry Potter movies. Remember, 20 years ago, there were a bunch of follow-the-leader fantasy boom in children's fantasy. Same thing will happen again, but for television. That there'll be a follow-the-leader effect. So, children's fantasy, young adult fantasy, is already doing great, and is probably on the verge of an even bigger boom. So, how can anyone right now make the blanket statement that fantasy, which is a broad category with multiple subgenres, that the fantasy TV boom is over because Wheel of Time got canceled this last week of May? When that same week, this same week Wheel of Time was canceled, last week of May, Warner announced the casting for the core trio of child actors on the Harry Potter TV series. That you could even see those two headlines together on the same news site. Wheel of Time canceled, Harry Potter casting. Well, I guess fantasy is dead. There's different genres, and yes, we're talking about adult fantasy, but there's something there. But this covers a bunch of things. My point was mostly that we're not talking about children's fantasy, which is, Harry Potter is a multi-$100 million franchise, so it's not as if that's nothing. People pay money for it. There's nothing shameful about being a really good children's franchise. They mean things to people. People grew up with it. Oh, another thing is, looking ahead to that boom, I think it's already affecting Netflix, because they revived their Chronicles of Narnia pitch from scratch. Well, they have the right that they restarted from scratch with a new writer, and they actually, farther than the other thing, which was just discussions, this time they announced a showrunner. Actually, a very high-profile one, that they put Greta Gerwig is in charge of the upcoming Netflix Narnia series. She was the director of the Barbie movie. So I wish her well. This is a children's fantasy, not Game of Thrones scale fantasy, but you are already seeing that children's fantasy boom gearing up. Because when production cycles take a full 2, if not 3 years, like the movie industry, you can see trends coming 2 or 3 years in advance because you see what the producers are starting to express interest in. New section here, though. Having said all of that, Up to now, I said that the post-Game of Thrones fantasy boom didn't really happen in the first place. It was hyped as a bigger boom than what really happened. Because out of maybe 20 or so going by these lists, 20 or so fantasy projects being actual lists being made in 2019 and things like Vanity Fair and whatever, out of those 20 or so, a couple were never even produced. Many were knockoffs that didn't last more than one season, or some were moderate but never really at that scale to begin with. And others were children's or young adult fantasy, both of which should never have been counted as the next Game of Thrones or part of this, and which are actually booming now. Backtracking, that when I said they weren't all one-season failures, some of these are what I call moderate successes, but they were never intended to be a Game of Thrones scale thing. And some of them were successful on their own terms. I mean, case in point, HBO's adaptation of the His Dark Materials trilogy. That TV series, after a terrible movie adaptation years ago, that TV adaptation, 3 seasons to cover a trilogy of books, 1 season each, and then it was done. It was well received by both TV critics and fans of the books. It was a good adaptation. I've watched parts of it, it looked nice, I just wasn't into it, but that was great. It was a great star vehicle for Daphne Keane after Logan. That was her project, she played the lead. But it was a success on its own terms for its book fandom, and then it ran its course. That I think it even broke even money-wise. It's just, this isn't going to be the thing people are, putting stickers on their laptop for with the Targaryen sigil, or reactor channels doing live reactions to the Invincible cartoon, or The Witcher. Like, live reactors weren't covering it, it wasn't a merchandise thing. It was successful on its own terms. Does that mean the boom ended because it ended naturally for this one show, finished its adaptation? People were putting His Dark Materials in those lists of the 10 to 20 things that could be the next Game of Thrones, and I'm looking at this going, these aren't comparable. It's arguably urban fantasy more than this, but then you have a couple that were canceled, like Netflix's Shadow and Bone adaptation was moderately successful for a while, had a fan base, was rising in profile. Netflix canceled it, but I'd argue that isn't so much a fantasy backlash of any. I'm arguing against that there's a fantasy backlash. That's just Netflix being Netflix. That they hate long-running shows, that barring the 1 or 2 giant exceptions like Stranger Things, which has 5 seasons, they want to cancel most projects after 3 seasons. Because they started out as a movie thing, and their whole thing is, no, long-running built-up plot lines don't attract viewers. The algorithm decides for them that this works well for movies, that the algorithm picks what you watch. As opposed to, like, this is the Wheel of Time, it'll take 8 seasons to tell it right at least. Netflix would never touch that because it doesn't work as well for algorithm-based marketing. Which is silly that this is like, telenovelas do not function like that. If you're used to long-form adaptations of major novels and things like the telenovela format, they hate that. But Shadow and Bone, I really think that it was never a Game of Thrones scale epic fantasy. It was more urban, well, it's this early Renaissance. It did its thing. Netflix canceled it because they're Netflix. But the better example is His Dark Materials was a good adaptation from HBO that ran its course and the book fans liked it. Either way, I wouldn't count any of this stuff towards things that were true candidates for actively trying to be the next Game of Thrones, and what does that even mean? We're talking about flagship shows, major large-scale things. So if we don't count the moderate ones, or the knockoff ones that lasted 1 season, or even the moderates that were okay, or the children's ones, strictly defined, what are we talking about as the fantasy boom? That people use that term so vaguely and broadly. Strictly defined as medieval fantasy, we are talking about 4 big medieval fantasy shows that came in the aftermath of Game of Thrones, combined with the launch of the streamers, which all happened by the end of 2019. through 2022. You can count this on one hand. The 4 shows for the next Game of Thrones were... The first one that came out was Netflix's The Witcher, within the same years that Game of Thrones ended. So that got the most attention first. Then 2 that were on Amazon. 2021 had first season of Wheel of Time, followed in 2022 by Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, which went head-to-head in late 2022 with HBO's direct Game of Thrones prequel series, House of the Dragon. Witcher, Wheel of Time, Rings of Power, House of the Dragon. That is a boom of sorts. I mean, because these are not... You used to have one big fantasy show, Game of Thrones. Now we have 4 loosely concurrent ones competing with each other. I don't like to think of them as competing. I like to think of it as that a rising tide lifts all boats, that lots of things, like In Deep Geek talks about both Witcher and Game of Thrones, that Preston Jacobs is really into Wheel of Time coverage as well as Game of Thrones, so I don't see this as a competition. Wheel of Time really helped out George R.R. Martin by Robert Jordan gave it his quote of approval to put on the dust jacket when the first book was coming out. We're all friends here. But it was these 4 projects we're talking about when we talk about the strictly defined, not joke candidates, but the fantasy boom. Was there ever a boom even for these 4 shows? If by a boom you mean not just things that were greenlit, but things that were successful. Because out of them, the 2 that Amazon made had problems out of the gate. That their shows had very mixed first seasons, first with Wheel of Time, and I continue to argue a lot of that was due to problems from the pandemic filming. Yes, there were major changes, it's hard to separate them out, but it then got better over time, and that the whole argument is that season 3 got a lot better when they weren't paying attention anymore. But there was never this happy golden age, heyday, where there was a point where things were good for fantasy at Amazon. Wheel of Time had a mixed reaction in its first season. Lord of the Rings had a mixed reaction, I think just because it's held to a higher standard. Again, I think season 2 got better because it wasn't binge anymore, it was episodic. But there's still not being the widespread praise you'd expect of this is a boom. I wouldn't even call it that. It's not booming at Amazon. But saying the fantasy boom is over is like saying the Wheel of Time boom is over. It was never quite a boom in the first place. It was always struggling. And that I could see the potential, and it's just that many were criticizing it. It didn't get that widespread appeal. The only other ones are Witcher and House of the Dragon. Witcher came first out of all 4 of them, and I think Witcher benefited most from airing right after Game of Thrones. Within months of it, it really picked up that crowd. Plus, it's a good book series, and Henry Cavill is a good actor who loves them as just a fan level. He is a fan of the books, that he wanted to be this. He came to them, so... Witcher Season 1, and despite criticisms and stuff, looked interesting. Maybe it could have been. I'm saying just maybe if Netflix wasn't Netflix, but actually knew how to just let showrunners do their damn jobs. If HBO had handled it or something, maybe Witcher could have been better. I don't know what could have been. But Netflix so badly mismanaged it that season 2 onward, I mean, season 3 was, I hear, a little better, but season 2 was so bad. Like, I went and checked, most critic sites stopped covering season 3. They stopped after season 2. Most reaction channels, YouTube reaction channels, man on the street, for the popular fandom, really didn't do live reactions or reviews for season 3 either. The hardcore lore fans are still covering it on their channels, of course, but a lot of this is also, it's a video game as well, so the fandom is surviving with the video games and stuff, and like Radiant Intelligence has been a great friend to us in Westeros fandom, looking through filming reports and stuff, but Netflix really dropped the ball on this to the point that there were creative differences with the lead actor who left. It is going to run its course because they still they're filming the 5th and final season now. It'll cover it. It was only successful in its first season in terms of a buzzed about successful show that wasn't being openly criticized. The other one is, of course, House of the Dragon, which had a massive, critically acclaimed first season, more than Witcher. I mean, in terms of award success, viewership, everything. I still argue that it did better, and yes, Season 2 of House of the Dragon was mixed due to obvious problems from the writer's strike from a reduced episode count at last minute. House of the Dragon Season 2 was made during a writer's strike. What's Witcher Season 2's excuse? What is their excuse? That they had everything going, because you've heard of the internal problems, that no, we need to whitewash this, all of that. I can't prove this, I'm just saying there is good reason to think the House of the Dragon Season 3 could bounce back when we know one of the biggest problems was we were filming without live rewrites due to a strike. Even ignoring that, The Witcher as a franchise won't really rise to new heights at Netflix versus HBO has already committed to Dunk and Egg, a different prequel era. It's looking really good. Martin has been giving it a glowing seal of approval. They've openly said that their drama head, Francesco Orsi, we're going to film seasons 2 and 3 back to back. We have full confidence in this. So even if House of the Dragon never reaches what it was in season 1 again, I actually think season 3 will still be better than season 2 because no strike. There's Dunk and Egg. So as a franchise, I'm not just talking about one show, but the Westeros franchise has been revived at HBO, even though there's problems from the strike right now. Counting all Westeros as one show, cinematic universe, that's 2 fantasy projects trying to be the next Game of Thrones that ever had even an initial season's worth of success. That's too small to be considered a trend. That if you count the boom as greenlighting, well, Rings of Power never reached that level of popularity. Wheel of Time got really good, but the tragedy is that the season 3, despite being relatively speaking a lot better, the viewership was still down. When you're talking about viewership, buzz, and critical acclaim, there's only really been The Witcher Season 1, House of the Dragon Season 1, and even then I think House of the Dragon Season 2 has more defenders than Witcher did after its first season. Because there's still good parts of season. It was mixed because of the strike, but even accepting that as a given, that even in my rosiest scenario that House of the Dragon is this really successful show and will be again in season 3, I'm saying for the sake of argument, even if it was, that would be one show, right? One hit show after Witcher never recovered. That's not a trend. That isn't a boom that suddenly ended. So, was there really much of a boom to begin with in the first place? Now, this leads into the wider issue. My bigger point is that it wasn't a fantasy boom, because fantasy is too broad of a category. I mean, like children's fantasy, urban fantasy. It was never a fantasy boom, as in medieval European fantasy. It was the streaming boom for TV overall. That when all these new streaming platforms launched in 2019 to compete with Netflix, and Netflix itself wanted their own big budget giant scale projects like Witcher or whatever to compete with everyone rising against them like Disney Plus. All of these new streamers that launched within a 12-month period, 2019 onwards, wanted their own flagship shows. Word for word, Bezos at Amazon said, I want my Game of Thrones. So they made what they could get, which was Lord of the Rings and Wheel of Time as major franchises. It isn't just medieval fantasy. That let's widen the tent to include all of science fiction and fantasy, which is a term, it's SF&F, sci-fi fantasy. Of the 7 big streamers, I'm thinking about this, it's not 7, Peacock is a joke, so let's say 6. 6 is an easier number to work with. Out of 6 major streamers that tried to have flagship shows, strictly speaking, only 3 of them had fantasy flagships in the streaming boom. Netflix with Witcher, Amazon Lord of the Rings Wheel of Time, HBO House of the Dragon. But there was also Disney, Paramount, and Apple. What were they doing? Star Wars is a space fantasy. With Jedi and the Force and telekinesis and stuff, it isn't hard sci-fi, it's not Dune. And even then, Dune has, the psychic drugs and stuff, but The Mandalorian in particular is space fantasy. Wild Adventures. It's not even the political thriller that Andor was, but that was the hit that launched Disney Plus. Their flagship at launch was Star Wars: The Mandalorian. That was one of the leaders of the pack of the not just for Disney Plus, but the streaming boom overall. It was the face of that when things were starting out. And I'd argue it was pretty successful. Disney also had a different strategy, that rather than try to make the next Game of Thrones wouldn't be one really big show, like we're going to make The Witcher, we're going to make Lord of the Rings. They had the different strategy, we're going to make a cinematic universe of related shows that each has a shorter run, which has been more successful than not. I mean, obviously, it's like, I see it as one big meta show, the Star Wars TV universe. And sometimes there's a bad show, like Skeleton Crew wasn't that great. You could have a bad season of the ongoing meta show. But overall, people are invested in it. I mean, like Mandalorian functionally had 4 seasons because Boba Fett was an interquill. And then Andor had 2 really good seasons. They're the stuff we're all talking about. They are on a bit of a furlough right now because they're trying to figure out what to do next. But the bigger success is actually Marvel. Marvel was the other thing they launched with like WandaVision and stuff, and they did mostly one-shots. They didn't do multiple seasons as much. They had some great stuff to start with, like WandaVision, then Loki. They're a shared universe. They did run into a pit in 2023, but that was both movies and TV. And as I've talked about in other videos, they've since instituted reforms. They said, we run these things like movies, they should be run like TV shows, we should have full writing staffs, so you saw the payoff to that with Agatha All Along, and then that was the preamble to, they put on a pedestal, Daredevil Born Again is when the reforms are paying off. And they really did. It was very well received, that I think Marvel TV shows are back on track. And this is what I said in my video 2 years ago. I said, as much as there is one winner of the streaming boom trying to be the next Game of Thrones, if you define that as widespread popularity with the general public, but also quality enough that attracts attention from major awards like the Emmys, it's Star Wars and Marvel meta-series. They have their ups and downs, but I mean just overall. Maybe DC under James Gunn can do something similar, but are we now saying that, well, no, I'm talking about pure medieval fantasy. That other stuff doesn't count. Well, I don't count children's fantasy as much just because it doesn't tend to get awards. It's treated as adult-level drama, but are we making a distinction between medieval fantasy and space opera like The Mandalorian? Are we making a distinction that Jedi and the Force aren't fantasy, sci-fi fantasy? Are we saying that, well, superhero shows don't count as fantasy? Even though, like, Morgana Le Fay is a character in the DC universe, that there are fantasy elves and things in the Marvel universe. They've worked in the Norse gods. Is that fantasy or not? It blends together. So it's a big tent. Medieval fantasy, space opera, superhero shows. And what about, there's a lot of crossover appeal, period dramas, period war movies, or, well, what I'm thinking about is Shogun, a medieval period drama, high budget, high quality. It happens to be based on a real historical period. There's a ton of crossover appeal between Shogun and Game of Thrones. That was the Game of Thrones of this year. I don't think it'll be an ongoing hit because it was based on a one-shot book. And they can kind of make follow-ups to it, but it won't really be expanding that much. It'll be follow-ups to the hit of, that was like a one-shot, really good miniseries. Another thing coming later this year on Apple, Chief of War with Jason Momoa, which is a period drama historical war epic about the unification wars of Hawaii in the late 1700s. It is a one-shot miniseries, because it tells the story of the war up till his death and everything going on there. Does that not count as crossover to... It's a period drama, but let me even leave out period dramas. Space operas and superhero shows, are we going to argue that they do or don't? Agatha All Along is a fantasy show set in the Marvel Universe. Why are we making these divisions? Shouldn't we as science fiction and fantasy fans be united against the common enemy? The People's Front of Judea? No, just, why are we strictly defining this as the fantasy boom? Fantasy had problems, didn't boom that much to begin with, and even when we look at the streaming boom, step back at the wider streaming boom, even many of these science fiction projects intended, which were on the lists of things trying to be the next Game of Thrones, many of them were flops. We're talking about the boom as a greenlighting boom, not a boom in quality product. It was hit or miss. Mandalorian was good. That was Disney's flagship. What about Paramount? What was Paramount's attempt at making their Game of Thrones a large-scale spectacle epic? If you don't remember, a massively budgeted Halo TV series, which fans of the games hated and never succeeded even from the day one, from the beginning. So can we say that the streaming boom has ended, all is lost, and the sky is falling, because there's never going to be another show like Halo? Not exactly, it's just that the days of wild spending are over. Well, I talked about Disney had a slightly different strategy of have a cinematic universe. It's not fantasy as such, it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. That worked more than it didn't. There were problems, Marvel was reformed. Paramount is going to be bought out by someone else. Now, they have Star Trek, but it's just a good franchise. It's not a hit. And the only other one is Apple. Apple didn't really try to get a giant show. They had a good strategy of a lot of medium-sized shows. Like the Godzilla TV show is surprisingly good. Or Severance. Severance is not the next Game of Thrones in the sense it's this sweeping epic, but it has widespread water cooler popularity and critical acclaim. It is big budget because they have to build all these sets and everything, but it's a different kind of show. Does Severance count as sci-fi fantasy? It's certainly science fiction. So it is a different genre from Game of Thrones. Obviously, it's not politics, but I don't really see the problem. As long as we have is the age of good quality shows ending when this year had Severance. Last of Us Season 2 had its issues, but generally high production quality, and they're willing to pay for it. And Andor Season 2. Granted, Star Wars is going on break for a bit, but it's capable of things like that. And Andor, I like to see the glasses half full, that Andor Season 2 will inspire others to make good content. Not even, good directors. I'm talking about on a scale of years, like, as I was in high school when the prequel trilogy came out, kids coming up in high school today will come up on Andor. As I was reading the Timothy Zahn Thrawn trilogy in the 90s, this will be their thing and set the example for what Star Wars is capable of as a franchise. And we will see ripple effects of how good this project was for 20 years. We might also see some bad projects over time, but just overall, I see a strong... They might be going on break for a year or two to recharge, but overall, people don't think Star Wars is going to stop as a franchise. People don't think Marvel is going to stop as a franchise, and they're actually doing a lot better now, Marvel. In the past year alone, they've really turned things around. Point is, the streaming boom had hits and it had misses. But now the boom has ended, and they're not spending as much money. Was there a boom? Yes. Freely spending on things. And that's unfortunate, but we can adapt to that, and it's not going to end forever. When did the boom end? It ended in early 2022, when Netflix hit the subscriber ceiling, that they had these fantasies of infinite subscriber growth, and for the first 3 years, the attitude was, put out as many big shows as possible, get as many subscribers as possible for these new platforms, and we'll worry about profitability later. The subscriber growth will eventually lead to profit. 3 years in, they finally realized that's not true, that just because you have a lot of subscribers, they're paying pennies on the dollar for doesn't mean it's a profitable thing. You're running it at a loss. So when the problem is that Netflix realized there's a finite number of humans on the planet, that anyone who could have a Netflix subscription does. Anyone who can't afford it right now, that you are now in a zero-sum game. You've expanded into all the unexplored territory. You are now competing for people who can only afford one streaming subscription and have to choose between Netflix or Disney. You're not expanding into new countries anymore. That's a problem. That was early 2022. It shocked everyone. Everyone panicked, even though, guys, you knew it would end eventually. My point is, there wasn't really a break between when the boom ended and when the strike era began. Because the strike of 2023 was an immediate reaction to the end of the boom. The boom was 2019 to 2022, early 2022, but the rest of the year, all the major streamers were kind of in shock and paralysis and didn't know what to do. But by Christmas, it had become clear that the boom is ended, that we've hit the subscriber ceiling, we have to re-gear towards profitability. And as soon as they realized that, they realized, next year we're going to be working up to a writer's strike. Like, they knew as early as Christmas, there are fears of a writer's strike. You can see it in news articles. Even though the strike only began in May of 2023, everything from, summer 2022 onwards, in the back of their minds, they were worried about that. And it only got worse in early 2023, but there was no plateau middle era. It went right from, hey, it's a boom, to denial, where that's not really a phase. That's just, maybe the subscribers will go up again, to then, dear God, we're having the biggest strike since 1980, because the Screen Actors Guild is striking too. Basically, the writers lost the last strike, the 2007 strike. That all the things about residuals, that streaming is coming, they lost, and then the studios put their heads in the sand and went, Netflix isn't going to kick our ass. Then they did. The writers were correct. Nor did the writers win the 89, 87 strike. The last strike they won was the 1980 strike. Okay? Last time because the actors joined too. So this is worth it. That this was a sea change, paradigm shift of getting the studios to actually do this responsibly, to, oh dear God, we need full writing staff on every TV show, we need to pay them when they do rewrites. Long term, we needed the strike for the long-term health of the industry, that this will make, these are the reforms we need to not ensure, but try to prevent another Benioff and Weiss situation, where these guys are actually deeply unqualified and there are no other writers. That those aren't the only example of that, Benioff and Weiss, when you fake your way into, hotshot showrunners who are prima donnas that really don't know what they're doing, trying to leave their imprint on it, versus, House of the Dragon has a full writing staff. When people go, oh, I don't like Condal, you realize this is a team of people. The shifts in the industry to having a full writing staff. And yeah, there's still mistakes and stuff, but they're groups as opposed to one con man can get in and ruin everything. I went in a circle there, sorry, but the point is, why is TV going to be so thin for the rest of 2025 because of the strike? And that people looking now going, oh my God, Wheel of Time has ended, it's the end of everything. This same week, they cast Harry Potter. TV will be relatively thin for the rest of 2025 because we're in I think I could call it the double rain shadow of the strike. Well, think about it. Anything that was filming when the strike began had to instantly stop what they were doing. Case in point, The Penguin. They said we had to drop what we were doing. We couldn't film anymore because we film in New York City and the Actors Guild does that. House of the Dragon was in a bad place where the writers were part of the Writers Guild of America, but the actors were in European unions, so they could technically force them to film with finished scripts, but without vital rewrites, which were an essential part of the process, is what the strike was about. So they pushed it out anyway, when the smarter thing would have been, it was already delayed. You might as well delay it long enough to put out really good product that'll last for years, that people rewatch. So, but like Penguin, a lot of shows paused filming because they didn't want to film without rewrites. The strike lasted for 5 months. It lasted from May to almost October of 2023. So anything filming didn't come out by early 2024. That's why early 2024, I call it the rain shadow of the strike at the time. It's actually the first of two. That Penguin was originally going to come out start of the year, in Emmy season in the spring. Last of Us Part 2 wasn't really meant to come out this late. It was supposed to come out earlier, that they had to pause things. There was hardly anything in the first half of 2024. I mean, there was... Even House of the Dragon was still summer as opposed to spring, and it had problems that you only started seeing suddenly a really stacked schedule late 2024. We got Penguin, we got Dune Prophecy, Last of Us, Severance, Andor. That is no accident. That's the pile-up from the strike delay on filming. Now, right now, early June of 2025, we are in the second rain shadow, which is everything that wasn't even written because of the strike. Not paused because we wanted to do rewrites. Think about it, it takes 2 years to make something. It takes a year to film it, and before that it takes even longer, at least 1 year, to write it, plus the initial big work of casting the leads, which is a whole process, and making the original core sets. So let's say at bare minimum 2 years to make a new show. Anything that would have been greenlit to air now, wind back 2 years, May to October of 2023. Now we're June of 2025, so it's no surprise. We shouldn't be saying, oh no, the sky is falling, TV is over. Anything that would have come out this point onward in 2025 is something that isn't happening because of the strike. It's unfortunate, but, well, the two things are, first, it's understandable, it doesn't have to do with business trends, and it's going to end. That we'll get to, because that, I think of time zones moving across the planet, that like it's midnight in London when it's not here, that by the time we get to plus 2 years from when the strike ended, so early 2024 is when they were greenlighting things again behind the scenes and starting to write things again. Plus 2 years is early 2026, right? So that's when we'll start seeing all of these shows that popped up in the aftermath of when things returned to normal after the strikes. And advanced calendars say 2026 is stacked. I mean, HBO is, of course, stockpiling stuff on purpose because they have a big Europe launch then, that they're holding off on A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, the second Game of Thrones spinoff, until spring, hopefully to have House of the Dragon out by summer or fall or something. But we know they could have put out more big shows that they didn't. But other things, like Apple has a large-scale adaptation of cyberpunk classic Neuromancer. Or I count December as early 2025, functionally. December will have Amazon's Fallout Season 2, which was a massive hit. And does post-apocalyptic fantasy count as fantasy? That goes back into the argument of fantasy is dead. Tell me in the comments, do you consider Fallout to be a fantasy? Because the entire point of the original games was, it's like we took a traditional RPG and altered it to be equivalents in a radioactive Mad Max world. That instead of elves, we have irradiated ghouls. Instead of ogres, we have super mutants. It is a fantasy, but repainted to be post-apocalyptic. It is a sci-fi fantasy, soap opera-y thing like that. What do I know? I liked playing Fallout Tactics Brotherhood of Steel. It's a good game. I wanted it to be... Okay, the point is, there is a ton of stuff coming starting by December or so, and even then, if you count Stranger Things is going to start at Thanksgiving, which is near the end of the year anyway. Even though that's a final season of something. I'm talking about new shows, though. Fallout Season 2 will come in December. That might be as late as Christmas, so let's count that as 2025. They're holding off on that. Amazon is in active talks with Henry Cavill to make a Warhammer 40k live-action series, which is a space fantasy. And that will change the world. You're saying that sci-fi fantasy TV is dead when we're actually going to get something like that. Early as 2026, maybe later, depends on filming. So there are a ton of projects coming in 2026. I'll talk more about this in other videos I'm going to make a scheduling video of, there is a bunch of stuff on the horizon because it's going to be 2 years and change since the strike, and that's how long it took everything to gear up again behind the scenes. And even then, while things are thin for the rest of 2025, I wouldn't say it's without anything. I mean, for sci-fi or fantasy broadly defined, I mean, the big one, the summer in particular is going to be thin, but the big one I'm looking forward to is Alien Earth by Noah Hawley, who, that's Hulu, but Hulu's owned by Disney. So, okay, it's a Disney Plus aggregate for the corporation. The trailers look good. I'm really excited for it. That'll be the big show everyone is watching. That's space fantasy. And like I said, Chief of War is coming in August. That's a period drama, one-shot period drama. Welcome to Derry. Stephen King's Welcome to Derry is coming in fall, for Halloween season. Well, that's a horror fantasy, but it's still fantasy. Tell me in the comments. Does Stephen King count as fantasy? I don't know. The people who were listing on those lists of the next Game of Thrones included the potential Dark Tower series Amazon was considering at the time, which was later scrapped, but it's still think it's part of... The Dark Tower is the metaverse of every Stephen King book ever. But something with it, Pennywise, set in Derry, is a form of fantasy, of sci-fi fantasy. It's a horror fantasy. And what's the other big Netflix release that's coming August through September? Wednesday, Season 2. That was one of their top 5 shows worldwide when Season 1 came out. On a global scale, it was in the top 3 to 5, depending on how you count. How can we say that the fantasy boom is ending when Wednesday was this global mega hit? And I was talking about the irony of you're saying the sky is falling, everything is over after Wheel of Time was canceled this week. The same week they announced the core cast for an upcoming Harry Potter series. What else happened this week? May 31st. The Netflix To Dumb event, where they showed the first trailers for Wednesday Season 2. So I'm sitting here Sunday, I mean, it's a couple of days since, but Sunday, I'm looking at this Harry Potter casting information. I'm looking at these new Wednesday trailers, which are the talk of the world on every entertainment site, and looking at headlines going, fantasy is dead because Wheel of Time was canceled. It depends on the subgenre. If you talk about epic fantasy, even then, like I said, Mandalorian is an epic space fantasy. I really loved The Expanse because it was like a Game of Thrones in space. That was even a hard fantasy, which managed hard sci-fi, The Expanse, which nonetheless managed to be very Game of Thrones with gritty realism. That sci-fi and fantasy is a mansion with many rooms. It is a circus with a big tent. To say that fantasy is dead. Yes, they're going to be spending less money, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing because they were misspending a lot of this money on flops like the Halo series, or, I admit, mishandling Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings, and The Witcher ultimately, because while I think Rings of Power is okay, I openly admit you could tell the same story at half the price. That in terms of the amount of stuff they physically put on screen, I grew up with, like cheap effects in the 1990s and, Doctor Who stuff or old Star Trek where, we know the sets are cardboard. It's about the storytelling. That you could have told basically the same story. It doesn't need to be the most expensive TV show in history, and it would have then broken even relative to the amount of effort that put into it. That it's not getting Emmys and stuff, it doesn't need to. But if it's $1 billion show, it needs to. So, with all of that going on, we still have great shows like Severance. Well, again, different example because that is expensive. And the thing with Andor Season 2 is they said Andor Season 1 and 2, across 24 episodes, they said every episode cost on average $27 million. House of the Dragon cost $20 million per episode. Game of Thrones at its height was maybe $15 million per episode in Season 6 in a big battle episode. That we might not see a Star Wars TV project at that level for many years, if ever. But then again, we weren't watching Andor for space battles or empty spectacle. I think you could have told the same story without as much building fully realized sets. They did, gloriously so, which is what makes it such a classic. A modern classic, but it would have been the same story at half the cost, and we still would have loved it. So picture that you can still do something on the cheap really well. Just the ingenuity that old school, our forefathers, that George Lucas and his team put into A New Hope. When this thing is on a shoestring budget, I mean, it's expensive, but relative to what they were trying to do, the limited tools of the time, look what they were able to achieve with limits on that. We can get beyond it. So Severance and stuff is more of a techno thriller. And yeah, the sets are expensive and stuff, and we have to, focus on profit ratios now, but so many of these things, a lot of Marvel projects, like Ironheart isn't like set in Asgard, it's, set in with, robots and things, set in the modern day, that you depending on what show you pick and how you do it, or Daredevil is, urban superhero, you can still work your way around that. And I know there's an economic downturn for the next year or two or whatever, or it's not the boom where they're throwing money around, but that has never been a serious limit to good writing before, because what matters is the writing more than the empty spectacle. How many of these empty spectacle shows trying to be Game of Thrones failed? I still think we will have one or two really big flagship shows so long as they're critical darlings. Like, we will have House of the Dragon in some form. There will be Marvel projects that are relatively big. Amazon wants to make Warhammer. Amazon is making Fallout, which I consider a big show. Whatever it costs, it's worth it. If there used to be 10 big flagship shows trying to be the next Game of Thrones, and now they only make 5, how many good ones were they making even at their height? Maybe 3? So, I'm not overly worried that we're never going to get big shows again. And it might look that way right now because Last of Us and Andor just ended. But that's because the rest of 2025 this is when things that would have been written during the height of the strike would have aired, and they're not. But that just means they're delayed and going to double up in 2026. 2026, the whole year, is going to be a lot like late 2024, where suddenly there were all these shows piling up. So there is hope for the future. The sky isn't falling. This is a temporary drought, and if you just, for whatever projects, I don't know if you put the energy I do into looking up advanced TV shows, but not just what's going to be premiering the rest of 2025. I'm going to be making a different video on the future. If you look at things they are projecting to make in 2026, we have a lot to look forward to. From a business standpoint, I'm not looking forward to Harry Potter late in the year, but it will, simply by existing, launch a copycat boom, which in turn might pick up actually good ideas for children's fantasy and young adult TV shows. That we will be getting Fallout again by Christmas. I mean, that's technically 2025. All of these other projects that they are working on. That this isn't the end of the fantasy boom. This is the point where we refine and stop spending on stupid ideas and focus on the good ones. This is a transition, but it's not a problem, and it's not without hope. I've rambled here quite a bit. Like I said, I don't have the time to do this as a structured video. I'm sorry, this is just a podcast. But I will be making more structured videos on, okay, what do we have to look forward to once the rain shadow of the strikes is over? From late this year through 2026. I will be looking that up and making a more focused video on, no, these are the things we have to look forward to. This is just a lull, but it'll end. There is hope. Please like and subscribe so you can catch my upcoming video on that.